G'day, AIMCA. We're here with Derek Edwards, Professor of Psychology at the Department of Social Sciences at the University of Loughborough, talking about discursive psychology. So how does discursive psychology fit in with conversation analysis and ethnomethodology?
Well, closely in my view, in my preferred view of it. I mean, there are a number of things people might call discursive psychology. And one thing Jonathan Potter and I wanted to do when we started using that term was to distinguish what we did from a range of other things. But in our version of discursive psychology, it's closely allied to ethnomethodology as a basic way of understanding how the world works, and to conversation analysis as the best, most productive, most scientific account of human interaction and the way functional language works. So conversation analysis is at least an amazingly useful resource. It's also an amazingly useful practical way of going about investigating samples of talk. Its findings inform discursive psychology, and discursive psychology's interests overlap with its interests. So there are various features of conversation analysis which are of direct interest and could be just called discursive psychology without amendment. They just are. It's just a matter of what you call it. For me, beginning as a psychologist, beginning my academic life, I should say, as a psychologist, it's not a starting point for me now, psychology, in the work I do, but historically it's where I came from. For me, I take an interest in psychology's kinds of topics. For most conversation analysts, they began life as sociologists, and so they come to the analysis of conversation as a way of analysing the social order. And they start with sociological kinds of interests, like in membership categories and so on. I didn't. I start with an interest in categories in general, that all words are categories of some kind. And I was much into linguistics before I came across conversation analysis. So to me, there's nothing special about, say, membership categories rather than any others. Whereas if you're a sociologist, you just hit that one. That's going to be the way in which you address your discipline. So I address my old discipline my way, and that is I find in the same materials things of psychological interest, just as you can find things of sociological interest in there. And I also endorse the notion that what you're looking at is foundational to that so-called mother discipline, and maybe really should have been where it all started. And I think that's what Sachs was getting at with his notion of a natural history phase before the science starts.
So you mentioned linguistics. How does discursive psychology overlap into, say, other disciplines, like, say, philosophy or linguistics?
Linguistics is its own discipline and science. I think it's an underused resource, or it has been until recently. There are now close links between conversation analysis and linguistics, and phonetics and syntax. They're being pursued. It's a matter of priority. For me, conversation analysis is the prime resource for understanding language, and much of linguistics is really interesting and useful, and people don't make enough use of it, especially grammar and pragmatics. I think there's a lot to learn from that. A lot of people have been working for a couple of thousand years on developing an understanding of those things, and if we can borrow from that but inform it with a fundamentally empirical CA kind of perspective, I think it'll do us some good, and we won't keep reinventing the wheel. At the same time, there's something deeply wrong with linguistics, always has been, and that is that it's got a long history that has shaped it, in which tape recorders had never been invented, and they're basically working from a model of language based on written text. And so understandings of syntax, semantics, sentence structure, and so on, have been very largely dictated by this structure of written text, and that is not like the structure of spoken conversation or of free-flowing social interaction. So to me, my object is life, everyday talk. And conversation analysis is therefore the primary resource. But I do think linguistics is an underused resource. And I tend to think of that because I know something about it, having spent a few years doing it before I did CA. So to me, I'm often spotting things that are useful, and that there's a vocabulary there that I encourage my students sometimes to read about and see if they can use it.
You've published some philosophical papers, and you've got some other work leading in that direction. Does that have any bearing on discursive psychology, or is that something you might partition away?
I tend to partition it away. My take on philosophy is derived mainly from the linguistic philosophers, Ryle and Austin and Wittgenstein. And I tend to like Wittgenstein's approach to many of the traditional topics of philosophy as somewhat prematurely analytical. That is to say that they borrowed from and are deploying and using terms, concepts from an everyday language without ever having bothered to ask what are these terms doing there and what are they for and how are they used. So that in philosophy there's often a presumptive ontological step they take, which is that if you have, say, a mental vocabulary of, say, ideas, knowledge, belief, you take, say, knowledge and belief, there's a lot of epistemic philosophy about the difference between knowledge and belief, and what it takes to move something from the status of a belief to something that you would call knowledge. And what that's basically doing is taking those words which are in common English usage as ontologically, that is, that they're referring to actual states of mind which are different from each other. And so they're working out what is the difference. And basically what I think they're working out is, what do these words mean? If you ask what's the difference between knowledge and belief philosophically, I prefer to do a kind of Wittgensteinian move on that and say, well, what are the differences between the way people use those terms? And if you see how beliefs and knowledge are differently accountable in everyday conversation, in argument, in therapy, or anywhere you look, then you find what they're for and what they're used for. And after that, you're finished. You don't then have to do the philosophy and figure out what's the real differences between knowledge and belief. They're words, they have different usages, and you're finished once you've done that.
Okay.